History as it happens, January 31st, 2023, when Ukraine had nukes.
It seems clear all the time that contrary to official statements out of Moscow, that this move was extra-constitutional.
The first sign of the coup d'etat that removed Mikhail Gorbachev from power.
The most important politician in the country to be freely elected, Boris Yeltsin, is now the central symbol of resistance to those who still have Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest.
After 6.5 years in power, Mikhail Gorbachev confirmed his resignation on television tonight.
The tricolor banner of the Russian Republic now flies over the Kremlin.
We congratulate them on the peaceful and democratic path they have chosen and for their careful attention to nuclear control and safety during this transition.
Yet freedom is not the same as independence. Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism.
In our meeting today, I strongly reaffirmed American support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. I urge President Kravchuk to continue to work to achieve Ukraine's accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
30 years ago, Ukraine agreed to voluntarily give up its nuclear inheritance. Thousands of warheads and missiles on its territory the moment the Soviet Union was swept into the dustbin of history. Was that a mistake? Would Russia have invaded if its neighbor still had nukes? That may be the wrong question to ask, and Mariana Budjeryn will explain why next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Skeptics once claimed that the nuclear threat would actually grow after the Soviet Union dissolved. But because of the wisdom and statesmanship of the leaders who joined me here, the skeptics have been proven wrong.
In early 1994, Ukraine's first president of the post-Soviet era, Leonid Kravchuk, held a joint news conference at the White House with President Clinton, where they agreed on the importance of Ukraine's pending accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state. Kravchuk spoke through an interpreter.
President, despite the efforts of President Kravchuk, the Ukrainian parliament has failed to ratify the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Are you confident that it will ratify this treaty? And will this $700 million of aid that you talked about today go forward if the parliament fails to take that step?
Well, first, I am confident it will ratify the treaty. Perhaps I should let President Kravchuk speak for himself on this. I believe that because the Parliament has supported the trilateral agreement, the START Treaty, the Lisbon Protocol, which is the first step toward becoming a agreeing to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm also confident because this country has already begun to implement its commitment to reduce the nuclear presence. I feel a high level of confidence in this. President Kravchuk again assured me today that he thought the NPT would be acceded to by the Rada, and that the real problem, the reason it hasn't happened just before his coming here, is because so many people are out campaigning, something that we all understand in this country. But I think it would be good to let him make a comment about this.
The thing is that having ratified START 1 and removing the reservations as to Article 5 of the Lisbon Protocol, Ukraine has committed itself, the political commitment, to accede the NPT as a non-nuclear power. So you shouldn't have doubts about the ratification or non-ratification of the NPT. As to the money which is allocated to Ukraine, that money is allocated for dismantling the weapons, and we have already started dismantling the nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Since achieving independence in 1991, the majority of Ukrainian political, military, and civic leaders, Kravchuk included, were committed to relinquishing the country's massive Soviet inheritance, thousands of warheads and all kinds of missiles. Making sure Ukraine, as well as Belarus and Kazakhstan, did not become nuclear states was a U.S. priority as soon as it started to look like the USSR might really collapse. And then when the collapse became official, Christmas Day, 1991, the problem went from abstraction to reality.
The challenge for us now is to engage these new states in sustaining the peace and building a more prosperous future. And so today, based on commitments and assurances given to us by some of these states concerning nuclear safety, democracy, and free markets, I am announcing some important steps designed to begin this process.
As nuclear historian Mariana Budjeryn writes in her new book, Inheriting the Bomb, while the Soviet Union was finished, the story of its nuclear weapons was only beginning. And there were questions. Did Ukraine actually own the nukes left on its territory? It certainly helped build them during the Cold War. Did Ukraine have the capability to use them, even if its leaders wanted to? Could it keep them? These questions dominated deliberations among the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine from 1991 up to the end of 1994, when Ukraine finally joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the story didn't begin in 91 with the Soviet collapse coming weeks after 92% of Ukrainian voters voted for independence in a public referendum. Or in 1990 when the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, adopted its Declaration of Sovereignty. Maybe a better place to start to explain why most Ukrainians were committed to getting rid of their Soviet nukes, even as they claimed ownership of them in order to compel both the West and Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and to win concessions like a security guarantee in exchange for denuclearization. Maybe that date and time is 1:23 a.m. on October 26, 1986.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
Diplomatic and other sources claim that more than 2,000 may already have died. Where the Soviets claim that the radiation situation is stable, U.S. intelligence sources insist that the graphite core of the reactor is still burning.
The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, writes Budjeryn in her new book, unleashed the natural force that humans had failed to keep harnessed. Chernobyl also helped unleash another invisible but potent force, indignation, a force that moves people to search for a more just and equitable way of organizing their societies and is capable of finding cracks in the most airtight of containment chambers. By 1991, this unrelenting force shattered the ailing Soviet Empire. And again, that is Mariana Budjeryn in Inheriting the Bomb. She works for the Project on Managing the Atom at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And the reason I invited her to come on the podcast is some editorial writers have recently called Ukraine's move to give up its nukes 30 years ago a mistake because it gave up its deterrence. And now here we are 30 years later, and Russia would not have invaded, the argument goes, if Ukraine still had those nukes. But as Budjeryn shows in her research, only a small number of voices were calling for Ukraine to build and maintain an independent nuclear weapons program to act as a deterrent. Although Ukrainians from across the political spectrum were wary that the new Russia under Yeltsin might act like the old Soviet Union and seek to dominate Ukraine. But for most Ukrainians, keeping the nukes was not a practical option. It would leave their country outside the community of nations they desperately wished to join. But this story does help explain how we got to where we are today, war in Eastern Europe, between two countries whose relationship could not escape the past, despite the heady optimism about a new world order that prevailed in the early 1990s. It is a reminder that history is unpredictable. Unforeseen problems appear just as known problems are resolved. And we're reminded of the possibilities that existed at a particular juncture and what might have happened had different choices been made. Mariana Budjeryn, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Martin.
I'm excited to discuss your book and this issue about Ukraine's nuclear disarmament after the Cold War and the road to war today. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about your recent trip to Ukraine. You were born, as you mentioned in your book, in Lviv, in the western part of the country. So you were just visiting family there recently. What was the mood like in the country?
Well, if I had to describe it in one word, it would be surreal. It was a combination of the most ordinary things that, in many respects, people, especially in Western Ukraine, still go about their lives as they would under normal circumstances. And yet these signs of war are everywhere. You go downtown in Lviv, it's a Renaissance city, it's quite beautiful, and the statues are sandbagged, and the stained glass windows in churches are boarded up. and there are many people in fatigues in the street. So you notice, you pick these things up, and yet, you go and you can sit in the cafe or go and, browse a bookshop, and suddenly there would be an air raid siren. And it stops everything in its tracks. And for me, that was the first such experience. I haven't been there since the war started. And most people are used to these things by now.
Wow.
In Lviv, air raid sirens don't induce panic. Actually, they don't induce panic anywhere. But, normally people would check, say, a telegram channel or a news channel somewhere and see exactly what triggered the air alert. And everyone's gotten quite savvy to know, all right, these are the Kajal missiles. We got so much time. And if these are the Shaheeds, that they're probably the Iranian drones, that they're probably heading for Kiev, but not for Lviv. So you can calibrate your response accordingly. The way the war and these signs of war, these manifestations of war have penetrated the daily lives of Ukrainians is really quite remarkable to observe. Electricity goes out, candles are lit at homes, and, things go on as they would otherwise. And downtown, generators aligned along the sidewalk in front of every storefront. When electricity is out, suddenly there's this hum of generators that fills the street, and everything continues working as it would otherwise. That's Lviv. As you said, it's in Western Ukraine. It's close to Polish border. There have been objects of critical infrastructure that were hit there. But generally, this is nothing compared to what, say, Kharkiv or Odessa or Mykolaiv suffer daily from Russian missile strikes.
And in the Donbass, which has been the scene of war since 2014, 2015, we often overlook the fact that there had been a low-level civil war there for 8 years prior to this invasion. But as you said, the entire country is touched by this, even if in Western Ukraine the damage is not as stark. But I suppose human beings are capable of getting used to anything, even air raid sirens, the possibility of missiles or bombs hitting where you are. Is there still strong popular support for the war effort?
Let me recount an anecdote or an experience from my trip that might help answer that. So I made my way. It's a difficult trip, actually, because nothing flies in and out of Ukraine. So you have to fly to Warsaw and then make your way by trains, planes, and automobiles to Ukraine. And finally, after this journey, I'm in my mom's kitchen, and we're sitting around with me and my mom and some cousins enjoying a dinner. Wine is poured, and it's a tradition in that part of the world to not just kind of drink wine, but to toast. So every time you raise a glass, you toast to something. So we raise glasses, and I toast to peace. And there's a silence. And then somebody says, to victory. And only then do we clink glasses, and only then do we drink. And that remains the case for the rest of the trip. Everyone raises glasses, not exactly to peace, but to victory. So the determination to persevere in this war is really great. And I think for Ukrainians, especially when you're there, it becomes very clear that this is a war of survival. And not only physical survival, but the survival of the country as a sovereign agent, right? As a political unit that is capable of deciding its own future. This is what's at stake.
Yeah, some observers have said that it's a genocidal war. I don't agree with that. I think Putin is trying to turn Ukraine into a vassal state to crush Ukrainian independence. For what reason? That's difficult to ascertain, at least from my perspective. I'm not an expert on this subject. But when you say to victory, how would ordinary Ukrainians, I guess it depends on who you ask, how would they define victory at this point? Does that mean expelling all Russian forces, even from Crimea?
I think that's the vision. At this point, I think the understanding is certainly from the standpoint of the military folks of Ukrainian armed forces, that until Ukraine is able to recover and secure its territorial integrity, it will be a low-grade or intensive war for however many years.
A frozen
And
conflict similar to what's happened in other places where Russia has. Yeah.
Indeed. And that's exactly what happened. You mentioned this war did not start on February 24th. It started back in February 2014 when Russians moved into Crimea and then instigated, a war in the Donbass and moved in their regular detachments. Even then, it was a lot less visible to the rest of the world back at the time because Russia took care to maintain some kind of deniability of its involvement. And it took a while to kind of independently establish and ascertain and all of that. But, Ukrainians feel like they've learned a lesson from that. With this kind of frozen conflict, it's a ticking time bomb. And all you're doing is pushing the war to the next generation. And there's a determination not to let that happen this time.
As you know, there's a debate in the United States as to, it's a growing debate. I wouldn't say that it's dominating the discourse, but it is growing about, how long should the United States support Ukraine, about whether this is a battle between democracy and autocracy that matters to the entire planet or simply matters for Ukraine's existence, right? And whether Ukraine is really a democracy. It had been a corrupt country. It's gone back and forth between being pro-Western, pro-Russian. Whether Ukraine is a democracy or not, it is fighting for the principle of the defense of national territory, and it's the victim of a war of aggression. So some of these other matters can kind of get caught up in propaganda, but that's how I view it. So I can't blame Ukrainians if they want to fight until every last Russian is off their territory, but there is an argument that the war is going to have to end in negotiations.
Well, every war will have to end in negotiations. The idea is that you must have a certain amount of leverage to negotiate with. How are you going to recover the territory if you're not in control of that territory? How are you going to ensure that your borders are secure if you have no way of,
guaranteeing it?
Guaranteeing it, right? Or striking the deal that would guarantee it. So negotiations right now would only freeze this really bad situation in place. But as you say, every war will have to end in negotiations. It's just not the time now. And what you said about Ukraine being a democracy or not a democracy, it is certainly a democracy. It's a very imperfect democracy. It's a country that is 30 years old. Think about the United States 30 years after its war for independence. It was a mess. And so has been Ukraine. It's a country that's building up its institutions. It has a whole bunch of these post-Soviet problems that plague every post-Soviet country. The only difference basically between Russia and Ukraine is that in Russia, all of this corruption got institutionalized. It got absorbed into the state. The oligarchs are Putin's vassals or have been expelled. They're not an independent political force. And all of these schemes and all of the money, it's part of the ruling system, of the political system. In Ukraine, the difference was there was a robust civil society that repeatedly opposed that kind of, a similar kind of system of ossifying and taking place in Ukraine. There was a 2004 Orange Revolution against electoral fraud that succeeded. The same set of protests in Russia failed, right? Putin got elected again and again and again, despite widespread fraud.
And then in 2014,
And then in 2014, Revolution of Dignity, that again succeeded. Now, to say that revolution has succeeded meant that it achieved its limited means, which is to oust a certain president or do another round of elections that is more transparent and more fair. It is not to say that suddenly a revolution can achieve building a better, cleaner set of institutions. That's a year-long process. And Ukrainian civil society has been unrelenting, especially after the 2014 revolution. There have been real reforms. It's just none of these things are done particularly quickly. And that's why Ukrainians really wanted for Ukraine to associate with the European Union, to sign this association agreement back in 2014, simply because that's one of the tools to put pressure on the corrupt elites, right? To have these conditions and say, hey, if you want membership in these European organizations, you need to adopt judicial reform. You need to clean up your state procurement system. And some of it has been done, right? So it's kind of a double pressure from the top and from the bottom. when Ukrainian society said, like, we can't just do it from bottom up. We need some help.
And that was a trade deal as well in 2014,
right.
Yeah, with the EU, and Putin essentially forced Yanukovych, or bribed him, Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president, to rescind on that deal, and then we get Crimea, Yanukovych's ouster, the Donbass, and here we are 8 years later. Now, it's tragic. Some of the military historians I've had on the podcast have said that, yes, it's going to have to be negotiations at some point here, but probably a lot more killing and dying is going to happen before that takes place. And all of that is happening on Ukrainian territory. So your point there is a great segue to discussion of your book, the heady optimism that greeted the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s and democracy and freedom on the march. These things are difficult to do, the transition from being under Soviet domination for all those years, then to try to transition into a democratic and open society, especially when your former boss, in this case the USSR, then Russia, still wants to have a role, right, in what you're doing. I mean, that's a huge part of the complication that you address in your book, right?
Well, yes, I think we're only now realizing some of the unfinished business, or some of the things that have been swept under the rug back in 1991, when this transition from the Soviet Union to the post-Soviet Union happened. And one of the things that went unnoticed and largely uncontested was the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia in most of the international institutions. Because of this perennial conflation of the Soviet Union with Russia, for some of the understandable reasons, right? Russia was the biggest chunk of the Soviet Union. Moscow was the capital for both. Soviet Russia did start as Soviet Russia and then kind of added all these other republics and peripheries, often through conquest, to the Soviet Empire. A lot of times, even very well-informed experts and political figures would use these words interchangeably: Soviet Russia, Russia, Soviet Union. But institutionally, these were two different entities. So the Soviet Union was the superstructure, right? The so-called center. And by the late 80s, it was Gorbachev who was leading that center. Those were sort of a separate set of institutions. And then there were the republics, and each republic had their own institutional, as it were, substance, right? Its own parliaments, their own governments, their own, certainly not ministries of defense and ministries of foreign affairs, but
a very limited sovereignty.
Parties. Yeah, I mean, sovereignty would be too much to say, but still sort of a system of local governance that was unimportant until it became very important in the late 80s, until these centrifugal forces started pulling the thing apart. And these institutional structures became the platforms for building up statehood. And Russia was the biggest and the most important, but only one of the 15 successor states to the Soviet Union. In the fall of 91 and early 1992, it sort of seamlessly, it seems, kind of moved into the space that was vacated by the Soviet Union. But there were leaders and other Soviet republics that contested it, and Ukraine was one of them. And one of the fields of this contestation was precisely the nuclear issue. Because when the Soviet Union fell apart, its enormous nuclear arsenal was the biggest in the world at that time. I mean, numerically, roughly on a par with the United States, of course, but some 30,000 nuclear warheads. All of that was scattered around this massive Eurasian landmass. And while the tactical nuclear weapons that were more mobile and more easily grabbable, as it were withdrawn rather quickly to the Russian territory before the republics could really do anything about it, the strategic nuclear weapons, and those were systems such as, intercontinental ballistic missiles and silos and bombers and cruise missiles, those are not very easy things to just pick up and move.
That's right. I got a crash education about the types of missiles and infrastructure from reading your book. All the acronyms there, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a bit of an acronym soup. So those got left on the territory now of not one state, the Soviet Union, but four separate states, and Russia was one of them. But then there was Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine. The question became, well, whose weapons are those? Who do they belong to? Who has the authority and responsibility to make decisions about these weapons? And B, what should be done with these weapons? And here it became the non-proliferation regime under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. That was a thing in the world. The world was not anarchy and orderless. It had an order, right? And there was something like a global nuclear order. And the non-proliferation regime was part and parcel of that global nuclear order. And so these new states had to negotiate their relationship with these weapons within the frames of that regime and had to choose whether to defy it or comply with it.
Yeah, the nuclear issue got caught up in all these other forces and issues that were unfolding during this very concentrated period. Independence, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, recognition for the new states. We're going to get to that. When we were corresponding, I mentioned to you in a note that I've done a lot of episodes about the aftermath of the Cold War and the road to Putin's invasion. But I haven't spent enough time on this issue. I didn't realize I was going to have to read a book about this issue either, but I'm glad I have. I've spent a lot of time on the issue of NATO enlargement and other matters and the Yeltsin years, etc. You start your book with an anecdote, and I kept thinking about the anecdote as I read the rest of the book. It kind of ties it all together. It explains the importance of the nuclear issue, not in determining what happened, but it kind of infiltrates all the other issues. And that anecdote was you as a young school student going to school one day, not knowing that the night before there was the Chernobyl meltdown. And then Chernobyl takes on a massive symbolic significance for you and really all Ukrainians and people in Belarus, a symbol of Soviet rot, right? And now we want to get out from underneath this.
Absolutely. It became more than just a humanitarian and kind of ecological or health issue. It became a huge political issue at the end of the Soviet Union. And even Mikhail Gorbachev himself said that Chernobyl was one of those salient things that basically precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, some of the initial aftermath, of course, got covered up, and the reaction of authorities was first uncertain. They didn't know whether to come clean with it or to keep hiding it. In the end, it was just too big to hide. It was too massive a catastrophe to be able to cover it up. And so this became one of the first major issues in the United States. And there have been other really terrible industrial accidents in Siberia and all over the place. There have been lots of cover-ups. I mean, the Soviet system was very good about covering things up and tearing the whole pages out of history books, right, that we only found out later. But this was a major issue that came out into the public, and it spurred this indignation with a system that was already failing people. It was already not working. Much of it was a laughing stock for most of the people. In Ukraine, as well as also in some other republics, such as former republics, I should say, Belarus and Lithuania, this anti-nuclear Chernobyl-spurred sentiment was picked up by the nascent pro-independence movements. See what Moscow does to us, see what kind of faulty reactors, what kind of rotten technology, and what kind of mismanagement and neglect are we suffering at the hands of this system. And in Ukraine, it became also a way to unite a country that was quite diverse in terms of its attitude towards things Ukrainian, in terms of identity, in terms of the degree to which it had been Russified and Sovietized, as it were, between the West and the East. So to unite that country on the basis of humanitarian and civic discourses, as it were, rather than ethno-nationalist type of thing.
Just as in the United States, where Watergate is applied to everything, we just attach gate to the end.
Right.
I thought of that when you, on page 110 of your book, you talk about linguistic Chernobyls and spiritual Chernobyls. Chernobyl came to symbolize the domination of Ukraine by this outside force. But it wasn't an entirely foreign or alien force. As you mentioned, many people in Ukraine were Russian and spoke Russian.
So the only region in which ethnic Russians were a majority was Crimea.
Yes. And also the Donbass had a lot of Russians, but not a majority.
It had about a quarter population was ethnic Russian or from other parts of the Soviet Union that were moved there. Well, primarily after that region got devastated by the Holodomor, by the forced famine instigated by Stalin in 1932-33, that basically cleansed about 3 to 4 million of Ukrainians, conservatively speaking, and into this hollowed out space, there was a move of people from other regions of the Soviet Union, including Russia. So that's sort of partially why the demographic in eastern Ukraine had shifted.
Well, I will share with our listeners how you open your book in the prologue. I want to remember Saturday, April 26, 1986, as a beautiful, crisp spring day. But in truth, I remember little because it was unremarkable. I took the trolley bus number 13 to Lviv Secondary School number 53, as I would on any other school day. A generation of Soviet school children, my generation, walked to school unsuspecting through the invisible thickets of ionizing radiation released by the explosion of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at 1:23 that morning. That was chilling. You know, I watched that HBO series, Chernobyl, which I also thought was very good. I don't know if you thought that was accurate or not. I guess the point I want to make here, or the question I want to ask, and you alluded to it in your last answer, was this nascent independence movement, this nationalist movement. It crafted many of its arguments about the need for independence around the disaster of Chernobyl. But the nationalists' arguments didn't lead to widespread support right away for independence, right? Even among Ukrainians who had had enough of the Soviet Union. Is that right?
I'm not quite sure I would put it that way. So, yes, there was probably a portion of the Ukrainian population at that point that was ambivalent towards certain views or certain guises of Ukrainian statehood, maybe that the ones that are based on the idea of a titular nation and a certain language, or Ukraine as a main language of the state. But let's remember that on December 1st, 1991, there was a referendum in Ukraine. And the referendum was a gamble. It was a real risky move by the Ukrainian pro-independence movement and the political forces that were behind passing this act of state independence for Ukraine on August 24th, 1991, right after the coup in Moscow had failed, right?
Yes.
So the Ukrainian parliament passes this kind of declaration of independence, but then it chooses to legitimize it popularly in a referendum. That was an incredibly risky move. And the referendum was scheduled for 4 months ahead and on December 1st. And over 70% overall of Ukrainians, it was a 90% vote for independence.
And it was overwhelming.
And even 70%, I meant in the eastern parts of Ukraine that were kind of the risky ones. And even Crimea voted majority. It was by a much smaller margin. I think it was 54% or close to that in favor of independence. Again, that was really perhaps a vote against the Soviet Union for many people, rather than in favor, perhaps, of a certain vision of Ukrainian independence, but was certainly based on the idea that if we can manage our affairs on the smaller scale, right, closer to the problems of the people, closer to this land, not somewhere far away from Moscow, but in a proximity to our reality here on the ground in Ukraine, that we can do better. And plus, by that time, there was kind of very little that was being left from the Soviet Union per se.
That's right. But in March that year, there wasn't a majority in favor of independence. Actually, there was a referendum pushed by Gorbachev to see if people wanted to remain in some form of Soviet Union, maybe a new union with more power to the republics, more autonomy. And the majority was against independence. So a lot changed in that short period of time. Namely, there was a coup that really weakened Gorbachev. And you argue that basically by August, at the end of August, in the aftermath of the coup, Soviet Union really is not existing anymore.
Indeed. And, this is also the tricky part about referenda and how you frame questions. And the referendum of March 91 that you mentioned, if you look at how the question was structured, It was something very leading, so something that nodded towards sovereignty. So are you in favor of this renewed union of socialist republics that are sovereign somehow? And it was a very loaded question, but that is not to, again, discard that under the circumstances, those were probably valid results. But those are very, very fast moving times. And what the coup had shown is just how brittle the system actually was. And then Gorbachev's reforms were sitting atop of this giant security and military industrial complex structure that could strike back any moment, as it did in August 1991. And the perpetrators were really the hardliners, and between them, they basically had the command of all people under arms, internal forces, Ministry of Defense. So there were 4 million Soviet military that, had they been loyal and complied, would report to these coup perpetrators. That's 4 million people with guns. For Ukrainians and Ukrainian leadership, that by no means was President Leonid Kravchuk at that time was part of the system. He was an old communist party member. He was in charge of ideology. But at that point, when he was in his office in Kiev, and the military people, the General Varennikov, commander of the ground forces, walked into his office, he realized, well, here I am, the leader of this quote unquote sovereign republic. And I have no one under my command. I have no one who would save me from this man that has 4 million men under his command.
He was worried that they were going to come and take him away. And you'll have to pardon my less than stellar pronunciation. Leonid Kravchuk, you said it much nicer than I did, became the first president of Ukraine. Reason I'm asking you about this critical period of time here in 1991 in independence, because although you had a burgeoning independence movement in the country and, of course, widespread disgruntlement with the old Soviet Union in Ukraine, it's not until independence becomes a reality when the issue of what to do with the nuclear weapons enters Ukraine's political discourse, right? Ukraine's new leaders, they commit to getting rid of the nukes, but there are a lot of buts there, right? They want a say in how it's done, and they're not going to give up that bargaining chip very easily, right?
So really, the first time the nuclear issue bursts into Ukraine's political discussions and discourse is during the deliberation and the passage of Ukraine's declaration of sovereignty. And that is July 1990. So that's a full year, at the very least, before the actual independence and the breakup of the Soviet Union.
That's right, yeah.
And at that point, if we remember, there's this parade of sovereignties. The Russian Federation actually is the first one. It's ahead of Ukraine in passing its one. And, to think about it, Russia declares its sovereignty from the Soviet Union, right? It's a very good example of the fact that the two were not tautological. The two were not one and the same, right? And that was this power struggle between Gorbachev and Yeltsin at the time.
And disintegration starts to become a possibility at this point, right?
Indeed. I mean, Russia declares basically independence from the Soviet Union, not full independence, but sovereignty means that the laws of the republic trump the laws of the Soviet Union. You could still, as a republic, decide you want to be part of that union, but that really, the locus of that decision is within the authorities of the republic, right? It's not somehow imposed from the top. And Ukraine follows suit, and a month later passes its own declaration of sovereignty. And almost without a forethought, suddenly, the leader of the National Democrats, Ivan Drach, is a renowned poet, takes the podium in the parliament and says, I have a proposal. I have an idea. How about we insert into this declaration of sovereignty a clause that commits us to become, in the future, a non-nuclear state that abides by 3 non-nuclear principles of not developing and otherwise acquiring nuclear weapons. And that gets incorporated into the declaration almost without any discussion. Why? Exactly because of this. As I later talked to this man, I talked to Ivan Drach and I interviewed him, and he said it was this Chernobyl mood that still hung over the society. So it was logical, right? And it felt right that Ukraine should basically unilaterally take on this disarmament. Beyond that, there was another reason, and that reason was an understanding by certain, well-informed people within the Ukrainian government that if Ukraine were to chart this course towards independent statehood, then as long as these military, very centralized military kind of chains bound it to the center, it could not do so. That's one of the ways in which Moscow would keep Ukraine tethered to itself. So you had to cut these military and especially nuclear command and control chains. And that was another reason for this declaration, for this insertion of a non-nuclear clause. It said, these are Soviet nuclear weapons, Soviet Union, you take them away. We want nothing to do with these weapons. Now that changes very quickly and becomes a lot more nuanced. When the Soviet Union falls apart, right, these are no longer chains that bound it to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union no longer exists. But these weapons are still there. And then the question becomes, well, the Soviet Union fell apart anyways. It's, in a dustbin of history, so to speak. And we're left with this nuclear inheritance. What do we do? And then it becomes a question of a lot more nuance, even though Ukraine never officially said, all right, wait a minute, we no longer abide by our unilateral nuclear, basically, or intention to become a non-nuclear weapon state. But the negotiations, the crux of the contestation basically becomes whose weapons were those? And Ukraine insisted they rightfully belonged to Ukraine because Ukraine was a legal successor state to the USSR, just like Russia, just like Kazakhstan, just like everyone else. Now, it happened not to want these weapons, but it was entitled to a fair compensation, both in terms of security commitments from nuclear states and in terms of the monetary value, of the financial value of the fissile material, highly enriched uranium and plutonium that was contained in the warheads. And that became the matter of negotiation.
It just goes to show you how fast events were moving, that not much thought was given to this until 1991, because prior to that, although the Soviet Union was having trouble, probably not many people expected it to disappear. and then, as you say, I had to read your book very carefully. Ukrainian leaders are saying, we don't want these nuclear weapons, but they're ours.
And that kind of shows you one of those questions that was really misunderstood in the West, because every time Ukraine insisted that these are our weapons to give up, there was a suspicion that perhaps kind of establishing this claim is somehow leading to proliferating or having nuclear ambitions. But for Ukraine, it seemed to have been rather a way to reconstitute this relationship, reconstitute this post-Soviet space, and gain the recognition precisely to the fact that Russia is not the only successor state of the Soviet Union worth paying attention to. And this nuclear issue became the arena in which this claim, this contestation manifested itself most powerfully because it became a very important international issue, right? It was like this new country, it just entered the realm of international relations. And the very first issue on which the world will engage with you is the matter of nuclear weapons and nuclear inheritance, right?
Yeah.
So
and with Belarus and Kazakhstan as well. So there would have been, instead of one nuclear state, 4. And the United States, of course, objected to that. Let me ask, was there any thought in Ukraine at this time that we might want to hold on or at least use the nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip because we're worried about Russia and our security vis-a-vis Russia?
Very quickly, some of those positions have evolved, especially into 1992 and 1993, when it became clear that this new Russia that many Ukrainians had been suspicious of, but also there was hope that at least under Yeltsin, it might be, this fellow aspiring democracy. Yeah. And Yeltsin did, Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, he did say, Russia is no longer interested in being an empire. Russia will be an equal amongst equals.
I think they signed an agreement to that effect, right? It was just
They signed an agreement to that effect, 1990 agreement with Ukraine, recognizing its borders still before the Soviet Union collapsed. And while Ukrainians were suspicious, sort of for historical reasons, of these claims and intentions, very soon it became clear that there might be a more present reasons to be suspicious of these claims and intentions by Russia, and that the new Russian might be just more of the old. There were immediately issues over Crimea, right, over the status of Sevastopol, which is the basis of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, over the division of the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet was not a Russian Black Sea Fleet, it was a Soviet Black Sea Fleet, and Ukraine had also staked claims to part of that fleet, and there was negotiations about that. And of course, the nuclear issue itself became a bone of contention between the two. So the relations between this new Russia and this new Ukraine really began deteriorating quite early on. And while, to be rather fair, while President Yeltsin and his immediate entourage of the reformers and the liberals were more in tune to perhaps this new, or constructing this new identity for Russia, this new non-imperial identity and democratic identity, there were forces in the Russian parliament at the time that never came around to that. And let's recall that as early as October 1993, there's another coup. And now Yeltsin is firing tanks at the White House, which, in Russia is the parliament building.
That's right.
And
a lot of people were killed on that day, yes.
Are killed, right? That's kind of this brown-red so-called alliance in the parliament of the former communists and the Russian nationalists that are really challenging authority of Boris Yeltsin and are really regretting the collapse of the Soviet Union, are really not prepared to let go.
The reason I asked you that question is because today, some commentators, some editorial writers are saying, well, it was a mistake that Ukraine gave up its nukes. Now, a lot happened between 1992, 91, 92, and 2022. We have Yeltsin's successor in 1999. To your earlier point about Russian nationalists who did not want to respect Ukraine's sovereignty or independence. Well, I don't know how passionately Yeltsin held to that idea, but certainly Putin has. But I don't know, I think it's maybe wrong to second-guess that decision. But you addressed this question actually in the conclusion of your book, where you added some extra thoughts, if you will, dated May of 2022.
So you're absolutely right. Hindsight is 2020, and we cannot judge that decision back in 1994, early 90s, based on what we know today. I get asked all the time, was that the right thing to do, to give up nuclear weapons, or rather nuclear inheritance from the Soviet Union? And I decided I am going to answer it in one of two ways. And one is to say, well, why don't you read my book and make your own conclusions? And another one is to say that the jury is still out. We're still capable of proving Ukraine right, based on how we as a collective West, we as thinkers and analysts and people who have any impact on what might be Western participation or support for Ukraine at this moment, we still have the power to prove Ukraine right, to say that a country that does the right thing by the international non-proliferation regime, by the kind of the global nuclear order, that does not do the North Korean thing or the Iranian thing, and does not go and proliferate and add to the total number of nuclear states in the world, that country will not be left to stand alone against a belligerent nuclear power. The war does raise a lot of very difficult questions about the role of nuclear weapons. I don't think it is, somehow accidental or unimportant. This major war in Europe, the intensity of it is only comparable to World War II. With all these other wars and conflicts we've lived through, just, at the rate at which the armaments are being used up, the intensity of
the casualty
this war,
rate is enormous.
And the casualty rate on both sides, which we don't know even the full scope of yet, is incredibly high, that kind of war can break out in a country that is not covered by nuclear deterrence. It's not covered by a nuclear deterrence of its own. Ukraine does not have its own nuclear deterrence, nor is it covered by extended nuclear deterrence of an ally, like the NATO countries are. So you have this giant security vacuum. As you said in the beginning of our conversation, it's a security no man's land.
It raises the NATO issue and deterrence, as I mentioned in your conclusion. Ukraine was vaguely promised NATO membership at some future point. We all remember the Bucharest conference in 2008 with George W. Bush when he went up there and said, Ukraine and Georgia.
This week, our alliance must also decide how to respond to the request by Georgia and Ukraine to participate in NATO's membership action plan. These two nations inspired the world with their rose and orange revolutions, and now they're working to consolidate their democratic gains and cement their independence. Welcoming them into the membership action plan would send a signal to their citizens that if they continue on the path to democracy and reform, they will be welcomed into the institutions of Europe. It would send a signal throughout the region that these two nations are and will remain sovereign and independent states.
And Putin and the Russian establishment's response to that was rather negative, of course. And no Russian leaders, Russian military, Russian foreign policy establishment, since 1991 to present, none of them have ever wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. So it was like the worst of both worlds, right? It was an irritant to Russia, and Ukraine never got into NATO anyway.
I agree with you that that particular way in which this was kind of dangled in front of Ukraine and dangled as a red flag in front of Russia without any particular practical follow-up from that Bucharest conference that you mentioned and that Bucharest declaration, it was indeed the worst of both worlds. And, from Ukraine's standpoint, what security options do you have, right? You either fold under Russia, like Belarus, and become a vassal state. Even if some Ukrainian leaders, such as President Yanukovych, whom you mentioned, even if he were quite ready to do something like that, Ukrainian population just wouldn't let that happen. They went out and they protested for 3 months, and 100 people died in that standoff.
And there were snipers shooting people in the street. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. So that was just like Ukraine is just a different kind of society. Belarusian option was never an option for Ukraine. And then you have Western direction, and there was a lot of hesitation, especially on the part of European NATO allies such as Germany and France, right, that did not want to see that happen, or rely on your own forces, right? Arm yourself to the teeth. Perhaps something of the kind that Israel does, right? Kind of this garrison state, this really a fortress, and relies for much of its security on a partnership with the United States.
And nuclear weapons that they don't admit they have or deny they have. Yeah. So
and that worst-kept secret of Israeli nuclear weapons.
To the question, should Ukraine have kept its nukes? I mean, in a sense, it's an impossible question to answer, or maybe it's the wrong question, because there really wasn't a realistic possibility that it could if it wanted to remain in the community of nations, right? You mentioned the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There were only supposed to be 5 nuclear states, the United States being one, the Soviet Union, then Russia, after 1991 being another one of them. You couldn't have Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan becoming 3 new ones. Kravchuk wanted to get diplomatic recognition for the new sovereign Ukrainian state. He wasn't going to be able to get that from the United States if he insisted on keeping nuclear weapons. Ukraine also did not want to go the route of being a rogue nuclear country like India, Pakistan, whoever. North
right.
Korea.
Although it is a stretch to say that India and Pakistan are rogue nuclear states. They're not. They are setting a precedent of being 2 states together with Israel, perhaps 3 states, that are outside of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and that are really not under any considerable amount of international opprobrium.
That's right. Rogue is probably the wrong word, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, North Korea would have been rogue. Iraq would have been rogue. Libya would have been a rogue state. So there is this kind of increasing normalization of India and Pakistan. Let's say Israel is some kind of exception to the rule as that state is to many rules. The increased normalization of India and Pakistan is a troubling precedent. It's normalizing that space for nuclear possession outside of the regime. Now, that space was not cut out yet in the early 90s. Let's not forget that, India and Pakistan did not sort of come out of the nuclear closet until 1998. This historical timing is all very important. Also, let's not forget that the NPT itself was nearing a very important milestone, the 1995 Review and Extension Conference, in which that treaty was due to be extended either for a certain period of time or indefinitely. And the United States was very much interested in having it extended indefinitely. And there was all sorts of pressures to get the post-Soviet states, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, to accede to the treaty before that important conference. But to go back to the discussion of what were Ukraine's options and whether that was the right decision, let me start by saying that when I got into this research, there were sort of two main narratives or positions that you would hear on this whole question. A lot of times in Ukraine, you would hear, oh, we have the world's third largest nuclear arsenal and we gave it up for nothing. That was one. Here in the United States, you would often hear, those were not even Ukraine's weapons to give up. Ukraine did not have command and control, and it didn't really have any options anyways. Those are sort of two polar opposites. What my book attempts to reveal is that the truth, or small t truth, as much as we can approximate that, is somewhere in the middle. No, Ukraine did not inherit a fully fledged nuclear deterrent. And yes, Ukraine would have had to build up significant parts of a nuclear weapons program should it have decided to go that route, right? It was missing big chunks of the nuclear fuel cycle, would have had to have a warhead production facility and all of that. But no, it was not some kind of monkey with a grenade, as at the time, Russian propaganda was trying to kind of create this imagery.
Wow.
Ukraine was part and parcel of a Soviet military-industrial complex. It was an incredibly generously endowed country with all sorts of facilities that could have been leveraged for the purpose of that program. Ukraine was the site of one of the three major missile building facilities in the Soviet Union, Pivdenne Design Bureau and Pivdenmash, known in Russian as Yuzhny and Yuzhmash. Giant missile producing manufacturer.
You make a great point about timing there. Pakistan and India, late 1990s. When all this is happening in the early 1990s, we're in the midst of what you might call the golden age of disarmament pacts. And the world was moving in this direction rather than the other way. We've been backsliding since. And maybe we can wrap up here with your thoughts on this really troubling development in recent years that goes under the radar, although the war now in Ukraine has brought this back to the fore where it belongs. The New START Treaty is the only treaty left on the number and types of U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons, and that expires in a couple of years. And as Mary Elise Serrati has argued, and she has also written a book that I find to be a must-read along with yours, Not 1 Inch, about NATO enlargement post-1991, she says there's very little hope of renewal of New START. The ABM Treaty is gone, abrogated in 2002. The Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, Vladimir Putin suspended it in 2007, or suspended Russian participation. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which was celebrated when Gorbachev and Reagan signed it in the 1980s. I know this is a difficult question to answer, Mariana, but how do we get this going in the other direction? We're in an age of nuclear proliferation again, rather than non-proliferation.
I do not have, unfortunately, a good answer to that question, and I dare anyone to come up with one. It is really an unfortunate state of affairs where we're looking for the first time in decades, in 5 decades, 7 decades, to have a world without any constraint on nuclear weapons of the major nuclear possessors. With the expiration of the New START in February 2026, it was already extended once. I mean, the best we could hope that maybe two sides can decide to sort of freeze those levels, New START levels, and not build up over it. It is difficult to see whether that would be in the interest of, say, Russia, that has shown its conventional army to be much less than what anyone had expected it to be, and therefore is likely to rely more on its nuclear component, on its nuclear deterrent, in face of this conventional inferiority. We know from history that that is likely to happen. Relations weren't particularly stellar before the war began. They're pretty much non-existent now. And again, President Putin has suspended on-site inspections, or the resumption of on-site inspections that are part of New START treaty. And he seems to want to use it as political leverage, which again, even during the Cold War and some of the really low periods of relations between two superpowers, there seemed to have still been some kind of cooperation on arms control and some kind of cooperation on non-proliferation.
In the Brezhnev years, which were a cold period, there was communication. Yeah, it's troubling.
It is very troubling. And then that happens against the background of now TPNW, the ban treaty, really rallying those non-nuclear weapon states that are disgruntled and upset about the inadequate fulfillment of exactly that, like the cessation of arms race, right? Article 6 of the NPT, obligations of nuclear weapon states to pursue arms control and reductions in good faith. And of course, that is not likely to happen. So I see this reverberating in many nefarious ways across the entire global nuclear order. Of course, some of these tensions already existed. There are probably nothing particularly new that the war will introduce into these various equations. It will only make the existing tensions more severe and more difficult to reconcile.
Mariana Budjeryn, author of Inheriting the Bomb. We thank you for a fascinating conversation. On the next episode of History as It Happens, supporters of Ukraine have been criticizing Germany for its reluctance to send tanks to Ukraine to help fight the Russians. But the reasons why Germany has been hesitant to get deeply involved in the war can be found in Germany's history. And that's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.